My name is Sienna, 33 years old and a forensic accountant who specializes in corporate financial fraud. After a screaming match at my husband's family gathering, everyone turned on me. Even my husband grabbed my arm and snapped that I needed to apologize or pack my bags and leave. Instead, I bought two one-way tickets for me and our 5-year-old daughter. By the time they learned we had left the country, it was too late, and all the color drained from their faces when they realized what I took with me. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments down below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic in-laws. The crash of crystals shattering against the imported marble floor echoed through the grand dining room. I barely had time to blink before an empty velvet jewelry box bounced off my chest and landed at my feet. "You stole it!" Vanessa's voice was a hysterical shriek that bounced off the vaulted ceilings of her mother's mansion. My 31-year-old sister-in-law stood at the opposite end of the long mahogany table, her face flushed red with theatrical rage. Grandmother's diamond brooch is gone, and we all know exactly where it went. I stared at the empty blue velvet box on the floor, then back at Vanessa. My voice remained completely steady. "I have no idea what you are talking about, Vanessa. I have not been upstairs all evening." Catherine, my 62-year-old mother-in-law, adjusted her posture at the head of the table. She wore her signature pearls and a look of practiced disappointment. "Now, Sienna," Catherine said, her tone dripping with fake sympathy. "We know your background. We know your family struggled. If you needed money that desperately, you could have just asked Tristan instead of resorting to petty theft in my home." I looked around the table. DeAndre, Vanessa's husband, leaned back in his chair. As a highly successful African-American corporate defense attorney, he usually maintained a professional detachment, but right now he crossed his arms and offered me a look of pure condescension. He was the family's legal attack dog, always ready to clean up their messes, and he clearly thought I was just another problem to be managed. I turned to my husband, expecting him to shut down this ridiculous accusation. Tristan was a wealth manager for his family's estate. We had been married for 6 years, and I thought we were a team. Instead, he stood up his chair, scraping violently against the floor. He marched over to my side of the table, but he did not stand between me and his family. He stood shoulder to shoulder with them. Tristan grabbed my arm. His grip was rough, his fingers digging into my skin. "Stop lying, Sienna," he hissed through clenched teeth. "Just admit it. You have always been jealous of Vanessa. You have been holding a grudge ever since we met." "Tristan, let go of me," I warned softly, glancing down at his hand. He tightened his grip, pulling me an inch closer to his face. "You cannot stand the fact that you had to work 3 jobs in college just to afford rent while she was studying art history in Milan. You hate that my family has real wealth while yours had nothing. You took the brooch to pay off whatever debts your relatives are hiding. Apologize to my sister right now." The silence in the room was absolute. I looked at the man I had married, the man who was currently bruising my arm to defend a spoiled sister who covered her own debts with fake luxury and constant attacks on me. I saw the arrogance in his eyes, the certainty that his family's money made him invincible, and the deep-seated belief that my working-class background made me inherently untrustworthy. He really believed I was the villain here. Or worse, he did not care if I was innocent, as long as he kept his mother and sister happy. For years I had swallowed my pride to keep the peace. I had smiled politely when Catherine gifted me etiquette books. I had stayed silent when Vanessa mocked my sensible shoes. I had brushed it off when Tristan used our joint bank accounts to control my spending. But tonight they had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice or defend myself against their baseless accusations. The panic and tears they were hoping to provoke simply did not exist. My mind, trained to dissect complex financial fraud and expose hidden truths, went completely cold and calculated. I reached over with my free hand and pried Tristan's fingers off my arm one by one. I smoothed the fabric of my dress, picked up my linen napkin, and placed it neatly on the table beside my untouched plate. "Apologize." Tristan snapped, his face turning an ugly shade of purple. Apologize to my sister and get out of my mother's house. I picked up my purse. I looked at Vanessa, who was smirking triumphantly, certain she had finally put the new money trash in her place. I looked at Catherine, who was already signaling a waiter to clean up the broken glass. And finally, I looked Tristan dead in the eye. I leaned in close so only he could hear me. "You will deeply regret giving me that option," I whispered. I walked out of the room, my head held high. The heavy front doors shut behind me. Outside, a freezing rain was pouring down on the manicured driveway. I stepped into the storm, letting the icy water wash away the last traces of the woman I used to be. They wanted me out of their sight. I was finally going to give them exactly what they asked for. The hum of the jet engines shifted into a lower register as we began our descent over the Swiss Alps. Morning light spilled through the cabin windows, illuminating the snow-capped peaks in brilliant shades of gold and pale pink. Beside me, Lily stirred in her first-class pod, her small hands clutching the fleece airline blanket. She had slept through the entire transatlantic crossing, completely unaware that our lives had fundamentally changed. I reached over and gently brushed a stray curl from her forehead. We were safe. The physical distance between us and Tristan's toxic family was now measured in thousands of miles. But the real barrier I had constructed was financial and legal. The wheels touched down smoothly on the tarmac at Geneva Airport. As the aircraft taxied to the gate, I powered on my secure secondary laptop. I did not need a phone to know exactly what was happening back in Boston. The timeline I had meticulously planned was already executing itself with ruthless precision. By now, Tristan would be waking up in one of the lavish guest bedrooms at Catherine's estate, nursing a massive hangover from the vintage scotch he always drank when he was angry. He would wait until mid-morning, ensure I had had enough time to panic about my situation, and then call his private wealth manager to freeze all of our joint checking and savings accounts. He thrived on the power of financial starvation, believing that cutting off my access to cash would force me to come crawling back to his mother's doorstep, ready to accept whatever humiliation Vanessa had prepared for me. I connected to the encrypted airport network. A confirmation receipt from the Internal Revenue Service sat in my secure inbox. Tristan's private banker was currently delivering news that would shatter his arrogant reality. When Tristan demanded the accounts be frozen, the banker would have to explain that the funds were already entirely inaccessible. They had not been locked by Tristan. They had been seized by the federal government. While Tristan assumed I was spending my days organizing household expenses, I had been exercising my skills as a forensic accountant. I had systematically audited my own husband. Convinced of his own invincibility, Tristan left a digital trail a mile wide. He used our joint accounts to clean dirty money, funneling unreported capital through shell companies registered in Vanessa's name before moving it to the Cayman Islands. He was just a common thief hiding behind his mother's reputation. I had compiled every wire transfer, every fraudulent tax document, and every hidden ledger into a massive, undeniable dossier. The moment our plane had lifted off from Boston, my automated systems had submitted the entire package to the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. I was not just a disgruntled wife walking away from a bad marriage. I was a protected federal whistleblower who had just handed the government a multi-million-dollar fraud case on a silver platter. Lily unbuckled her seatbelt as the cabin doors opened. "Are we at the mountains now, Mommy?" she asked, rubbing her eyes. "We are, sweetie." I smiled, helping her with her small backpack. "We are going to a beautiful new house." While I was cruising at 30,000 feet sipping sparkling water and holding my sleeping daughter's hand, my husband was waking up to a pounding headache and a completely shattered reality. Tristan peeled his face off the silk pillowcases in his childhood bedroom at Catherine's estate. It was just past 9 in the morning. He reached blindly for his phone on the nightstand, squinting against the harsh morning light filtering through the heavy drapes. He expected to see dozens of missed calls from me. He expected frantic voicemails begging him to turn my credit cards back on, pleading for forgiveness, asking if he was coming to pick up Lily and me from whatever cheap motel he assumed we had fled to. Instead, the screen showed 0 missed calls. Just my single calm reply sent hours ago. "No worries, I understand perfectly." Tristan scoffed, tossing the heavy blanket aside. He dialed my number, fully prepared to deliver a blistering lecture about respect and knowing my place. The automated voice of the carrier operator responded instantly, stating the number was no longer in service. His irritation flared into genuine anger. He marched across the room and dialed his private wealth manager, Charles. This was Tristan's favorite power play. Whenever I questioned him, whenever I dared to ask why a mysterious $50,000 charge appeared on our statements, he would cut off my access to our money. He loved reminding me that I was a guest in his financial kingdom. Charles answered on the first ring, his voice trembling. Tristan, I was just about to call you. Freeze all the joint accounts, Tristan snapped, rubbing his temples. Checking savings, the emergency fund, everything with Sienna's name on it. Suspend her platinum card immediately. She wants to throw a tantrum, she can do it without my money. There was a heavy, suffocating silence on the other end of the line. When Charles finally spoke, his voice cracked. Tristan, I cannot do that. Tristan stopped pacing. He stared at his reflection in the antique mirror. What do you mean you cannot do that? You are my private banker. I manage an account worth tens of millions of dollars. You do exactly what I tell you to do. The accounts are already frozen, Tristan, all of them. Even your personal holding accounts and the shell companies registered under Vanessa's name. Tristan's blood ran cold. For a split second, he assumed I had somehow bypassed his security protocols and drained the funds. Sienna took it, he demanded, his voice rising to a shout. You let my wife drain my accounts. I will sue your entire bank into the ground. Sienna did not take the money, Tristan, Charles said quietly. The Internal Revenue Service did. Tristan's phone nearly slipped from his grasp. The IRS Criminal Investigation Division delivered a federal seizure warrant at 6 this morning. They flagged massive irregularities, wire transfers to the Cayman Islands, unreported income funneled through Vanessa's properties, falsified tax returns spanning 5 years. They have everything, Tristan. They have ledgers I did not even know existed. Tristan sank onto the edge of the mattress, his arrogant facade crumbling into pure panic. His mind raced desperately, trying to figure out how the federal government had obtained his meticulously hidden ledgers. And then the realization hit him like a physical blow to the chest. 6 months ago, I had politely asked Tristan for read-only access to the family's master financial servers. I told him I wanted to help reduce our tax liability by organizing his business expenses. He had laughed, called my accounting degree cute, and tossed me the security token, telling me to knock myself out with the boring spreadsheets. He thought I was just a naive wife trying to make herself useful. He had no idea he was handing the keys to his criminal empire directly to a certified fraud examiner. While he was out on extravagant weekend golf trips with his wealthy buddies, I was not picking out curtains or planning dinner parties. I was meticulously tracing every stolen dollar, every illegal transfer, and every tax evasion scheme he had ever orchestrated. I audited my own husband, and I handed the government a flawless prosecutable case. You need to get a defense attorney right now, Charles warned. The feds are not just looking for back taxes, they are looking at criminal money laundering charges. Tristan, they know about the escrow accounts you used with DeAndre's law firm. Tristan hung up the phone. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely breathe. The walls of his mother's mansion suddenly felt like a prison cell. He lunged for his laptop, frantically trying to log into his encrypted offshore portals to move whatever liquid cash he had left. Access denied. Server locked by federal mandate. He smashed his fist against the desk. The untouchable golden boy of Boston high society had just been outplayed by the woman he constantly degraded. Before Tristan could even process the magnitude of his ruin, the heavy oak doors to the bedroom slammed open. Catherine stood in the doorway, her usual immaculate composure completely obliterated. She was not wearing her tailored morning suit or her pearls. She wore a silk robe, her face pale and drawn, her hands trembling violently. Tristan jumped up. Mom, we have a massive problem. The IRS just seized the accounts. Sienna gave them the ledgers. Catherine did not even seem to hear him. She walked into the room like a ghost, holding a thick, cream-colored envelope bearing a federal seal. It had been hand-delivered by a courier just minutes ago. Forget the IRS. Catherine whispered, her voice hollow with absolute terror. She dropped the heavy envelope onto Tristan's bed. The bold letters on the front read, United States Securities and Exchange Commission. What is that? Tristan asked, staring at the envelope like it was a live explosive. Catherine looked up at her son, her eyes wide with the realization that their entire dynasty was collapsing. The SEC is launching a full federal investigation into the Master Family Trust, she gasped. They know about the forged executor documents. They know everything, Tristan. We are going to lose it all. The crisp, biting air of Geneva was exactly the reset my lungs needed after hours of recycled cabin oxygen. We breezed through customs with my Swiss passport, bypassing the scrutiny that would have delayed any regular American tourist. A private car arranged through my late father's estate manager was waiting for us. Lily pressed her small face against the tinted glass, marveling at the snow-capped peaks surrounding Lake Geneva as we drove into the heart of the city. We arrived at the flat in the Eau Vive district. It was not a hotel or a short-term rental. It was a fortress. The property had been in my father's family for generations, protected by heavy iron doors, reinforced glass, and Swiss privacy laws that even Catherine's money could not easily pierce. I carried a sleeping Lily into the master bedroom, tucking her beneath a heavy goose-down duvet. She was safe. She was entirely out of their reach. I walked into the adjacent study, a room lined with dark wood paneling and antique legal texts. I placed my encrypted hard drive on the solid oak desk, flipped open my laptop, and connected to the secure local network. It was time to assess the collateral damage I had left behind in Boston. Before I could even open the IRS portal, the secure satellite phone I had purchased in the terminal began to ring. I had only given the number to one person at the firm, a junior analyst I trusted with strict instructions on who to pass it to. The caller ID was blocked. I answered on the second ring. Sienna. The voice was deep, resonant, and vibrating with barely contained rage. It was DeAndre. He did not bother with greetings. He went straight into his courtroom persona, the sharp, aggressive tone he used to annihilate opposing counsel. Good morning, DeAndre, I said, pulling out a leather-bound chair and sitting at the desk. I see Tristan has already run crying to his favorite corporate defense attorney. You need to bring Lily back to the United States immediately, DeAndre snapped. His voice echoed slightly, meaning he was likely pacing in his glass-walled corner office. Do you have any earthly idea what you have just done? I am drafting international kidnapping charges right now. I will have an extradition order filed with the State Department and a Hague Convention petition on a federal judge's desk before you even unpack your bags. You cannot just steal a child and run away because you had a temper tantrum at a dinner party. I listened to his tirade, letting him expend his energy. DeAndre was a brilliant lawyer, but he suffered from the same fatal flaw as the rest of the family. He underestimated me. He viewed me as Tristan's quiet spreadsheet, pushing wife, someone who lacked the stomach for real warfare. Are you finished? I asked, my voice completely devoid of emotion. I am just getting started, he fired back. You are looking at federal prison time, Sienna. Interpol will be knocking on your door by nightfall. My firm has resources you cannot even begin to comprehend. We will freeze your assets, seize your passport, and have you detained. Bring her back now, and I might be able to convince Tristan to drop the felony abduction charges down to a custodial interference misdemeanor. He was trying to drown me in legal jargon, assuming I would panic at the mention of Interpol and federal judges. He wanted to assert dominance to remind me of my place at the bottom of their social hierarchy. DeAndre, I said, interrupting his monologue. You are an exceptional defense attorney, but your understanding of international family law is surprisingly sloppy. I am a Swiss citizen. Lily holds dual citizenship. I have a notarized, irrevocable travel consent form signed by Tristan himself just 6 months ago. There is no kidnapping. There is no extradition. I am residing legally in my own country. He scoffed, a harsh, dismissive sound. A piece of paper signed under false pretenses will not hold up in federal court, Sienna. You are a glorified bookkeeper. Do not try to lecture me on the law. You are playing a game you cannot possibly win. Tristan's family has the capital to bury you in litigation until Lily is in college. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the cool surface of the oak desk. They do not have capital anymore, DeAndre. The IRS seized Tristan's accounts this morning, and the SEC is currently dismantling Catherine's primary trust. A heavy silence fell over the line. I could almost hear the gears grinding in DeAndre's head as he tried to reconcile my calm statements with the frantic phone call he must have received from Tristan. "What did you do?" DeAndre's voice dropped an octave, the aggressive courtroom bravado suddenly replaced by genuine caution. "Before you file those kidnapping charges, DeAndre, check your personal email," I instructed softly. "I did not send it to your firm address. I sent it to the encrypted Proton Mail account you use for your private offshore consulting. Check it right now, I just sent you a ledger." I waited, listening to the faint sound of his breathing over the satellite connection. I heard the muffled click of his computer mouse. I heard the sharp intake of breath as the file decrypted and opened on his screen. The silence stretched out thick and heavy. I did not need to see his face to know that the blood was rapidly draining from it. I knew exactly what he was staring at. It was a master document meticulously cross-referenced detailing 52 separate wire transfers over the past 3 years. "What is this?" he finally choked out. His voice was barely a whisper. The arrogance was completely gone, shattered into a million irreparable pieces. "That is the reality of who you married into," I said. "Tristan isn't just stealing from the IRS, DeAndre. He has been using your personal law firm's escrow accounts to launder the money." "No," DeAndre stammered, the panic finally breaking through. "No, that is impossible. I review those accounts. I authorize every single transfer." "You authorize transfers for shell companies that Vanessa explicitly vouched for," I corrected him. "Companies Tristan set up using your wife's maiden name. Tristan knew you would never audit your own wife's property holdings. He used your firm's spotless reputation as a shield to clean his dirty money, and he used your login credentials to process the final clearing phases." I could hear the frantic clicking as DeAndre scrolled through the damning evidence. Line after line of federal crimes, all tied directly to his legal practice, his signature, his license. He had married Vanessa for her prestige and her family's connections, believing they would elevate him to the absolute top of the legal food chain. Instead, they had tied an anchor around his neck and thrown him into the deep end. The SEC and the IRS both have copies of that exact ledger, DeAndre. I continued, my tone entirely ruthless. "Tristan set you up to be the fall guy. When the federal indictments come down this week, they are not going to look at the Golden Boy wealth manager. They are going to look at the attorney whose escrow accounts facilitated a multi-million-dollar federal money laundering scheme." "Sienna, please," DeAndre said, his voice cracking. "My entire career, my life." I closed my laptop, the screen going black. "You are going to prison, DeAndre, unless you decide to finally stop protecting them." I ended the call, cutting off his frantic pleading, and set the phone down on the desk. The first crack in their impenetrable armor had just been formed. DeAndre was a pragmatist above all else. He was fiercely ambitious, and I knew he would never sacrifice his own freedom to protect a family that viewed him as entirely disposable. I walked over to the window, looking out at the serene waters of Lake Geneva. The storm in Boston was just beginning to rage, and I had just handed their best soldier the very match needed to burn their house to the ground. DeAndre stared at the blank screen of his secure phone. The dial tone echoed in his spacious glass-walled office, but the sound was drowned out by the rushing of blood in his ears. Sienna had hung up. He looked back at his computer monitor, where the decrypted ledger glared back at him like a death sentence. 52 transactions. Millions of dollars moving through his firm's escrow accounts, authorized by his own digital signature, washing Tristan's stolen capital before vanishing into offshore trusts. He did not pause to grab his briefcase. He bypassed his confused secretary and took the private elevator down to the parking garage. The drive to Catherine's estate was a blur of aggressive lane changes and mounting fury. For 3 years he had played the role of the grateful son-in-law, putting up with Catherine's thinly veiled condescension and Tristan's arrogant sneers because being attached to their family name opened doors in the Boston legal world. He thought he was using their prestige to build his empire. Instead, they had been using him as a human shield. DeAndre slammed his car into park in the circular driveway, completely ignoring the valet. He marched through the massive mahogany front doors of the estate without knocking. The atmosphere inside the foyer was chaotic. Servants were scurrying away from the main drawing room where raised voices echoed off the vaulted ceilings. DeAndre strode directly into the room. Tristan was pacing frantically, his face pale and slick with sweat, while Catherine stood by the fireplace, clutching a crumpled document bearing the federal seal of the Securities and Exchange Commission. "You son of a bitch!" DeAndre roared, his voice booming across the room. Tristan flinched, spinning around. "DeAndre, listen to me. We have a minor situation to handle." A minor situation. DeAndre closed the distance between them and shoved his tablet hard against Tristan's chest. Tristan stumbled back, grabbing the device as DeAndre advanced. "You ran dirty money through my escrow accounts. You forged my authorization for shell companies under your sister's name. You set me up to take the fall for federal money laundering." Catherine stepped forward, her posture rigid, desperately attempting to exude her usual aristocratic authority. "DeAndre, lower your voice in my home. We are dealing with a rogue, hysterical woman who is fabricating evidence. We simply need your firm to squash these ridiculous claims and file the extradition papers for Lily." "Sienna is not fabricating anything," DeAndre snapped, glaring at his mother-in-law with pure disgust. "She audited you. She has every wire transfer, every hidden account, every piece of fraudulent paperwork you two have filed for the last 5 years. The IRS did not just freeze Tristan's money, they seized it. And the SEC is coming for your trust. You are both looking at decades in federal prison, and you tied the rope around my neck to save yourselves. We gave you your career," Tristan shouted, his panic twisting into viciousness. "You were a nobody associate before you married Vanessa. We elevated you. If we need to use your firm's accounts to handle our private family capital, you should be thanking us for the business." "It is not business, it is a felony," DeAndre fired back. "You deliberately insulated yourselves. If the feds looked at the transfers, the paper trail stops at my desk. You made me the fall guy. What is all this screaming about?" The three of them turned. Vanessa stood in the doorway wearing a pristine white cashmere lounge set, casually holding a delicate cup of espresso. She looked entirely unbothered by the chaos unfolding in her mother's drawing room. DeAndre turned to his wife, fully expecting to see shock or horror on her face, as she realized what her brother had done to them. "Vanessa, Tristan used your maiden name to register shell companies. He funneled stolen money through my firm to fund those accounts. He has implicated both of us in a massive federal crime." Vanessa took a slow, deliberate sip of her espresso. She looked at Tristan, then at Catherine, and finally settled her cold, calculating gaze on DeAndre. She did not look surprised. She looked irritated. "I know, DeAndre," she said flatly. The air left DeAndre's lungs. He stared at his wife of 3 years, the woman he thought he was building a genuine life with. "You knew." "Of course I knew," Vanessa sighed, walking further into the room and setting her cup on a marble side table. "How do you think I afforded the renovation on the townhouse or the summer villa in Aspen? Tristan was managing the family assets, and we needed a secure way to distribute the capital without triggering tax audits. Your firm had the perfect infrastructure. You used me." DeAndre whispered, the sheer magnitude of the betrayal sinking into his bones. "You brought me into this family just to use my legal license as a shield." Vanessa rolled her eyes, crossing her arms defensively. "Oh, stop being so dramatic. We are the ones who put you on the map. Without this family, you would still be drafting real estate contracts in a cubicle. You need to know your place, DeAndre. Your job right now is to fix this mess, shut Sienna up, and protect the family." "Protect the family?" DeAndre let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "You want me to protect the people who just handed me a one-way ticket to a federal penitentiary? You think I am going to stand in front of a judge and take the bullet so you can keep buying designer clothes with stolen money? You are my husband." Vanessa demanded, her voice rising to a shrill, commanding pitch. "You owe us your loyalty." "I owe you absolutely nothing," DeAndre said, his voice dropping to a deadly, absolute calm. The realization hit him with crystal clarity. They were drowning, and they fully intended to hold him under the water so they could breathe. He turned his back on Catherine and Tristan and walked straight past his wife. He ignored her shouting his name as he climbed the sweeping grand staircase and headed directly to the guest wing where they had been staying for the weekend. He pulled his leather duffel bag from the closet and began throwing his clothes, his passport, and his secure files inside. He was not a glorified bookkeeper like they thought Sienna was, and he certainly was not going to be their sacrificial lamb. He was a highly trained defense attorney who knew exactly how federal prosecutors built their cases. The first person to cooperate was the only person who survived. Vanessa burst into the bedroom just as he was zipping the bag closed. Her aristocratic composure had finally shattered completely. "What are you doing? Where are you going?" she yelled, grabbing his arm. "You cannot leave. We have to coordinate a legal strategy." DeAndre yanked his arm out of her grasp. He looked at the woman he had married, seeing past the expensive facade to the hollow, greedy core underneath. "I am not going down for your family's greed," DeAndre said smoothly. He picked up his bag and walked past her, pausing briefly at the bedroom door. "You should probably call a different lawyer, Vanessa, because I am officially a cooperating witness for the prosecution." He left her standing frozen in the middle of the room, her mouth open in silent shock. He walked out of the estate, got into his car, and pulled out his phone. He did not dial a law firm. He opened his browser and booked the next available first-class ticket out of Logan International Airport, destination Geneva, Switzerland. Sienna had the ledgers, she had the evidence, and she had the upper hand. If DeAndre was going to survive the impending federal bloodbath, he needed to find her. The heavy blades of the industrial shredder whined as Tristan fed another stack of sensitive documents into the machine. Sweat dripped from his forehead, stinging his eyes and ruining the collar of his expensive silk shirt. The mahogany walls of his home office, usually a monument to his ego, now felt like a shrinking cage. DeAndre's defection had been the final fatal blow. Without his brother-in-law to absorb the federal indictments, Tristan was entirely exposed. "Stop acting like a cornered rat!" Tristan jumped, knocking a tall stack of blank papers to the hardwood floor. Catherine stood in the doorway, her posture rigidly perfect, radiating cold contempt. She looked at her son, not with maternal sympathy, but with the disgust of a general watching a soldier desert his post. "They froze everything, Mom?" Tristan choked out, his voice cracking with panic. "The SEC, the IRS. DeAndre is packing his bags and going to testify against us. I don't have a single cent to my name right now to even retain a defense attorney. I need you to wire funds to my legal team." Catherine stepped into the room and slammed a thick manila folder onto his desk. "I have already liquidated a shadow account in the Bahamas that your idiot wife did not know about. But I am not wasting it on defense attorneys yet. We have a much more pressing matter to handle." Tristan stared at her, utterly confused. "What could possibly be more pressing than federal prison?" Lily Catherine snapped. "Sienna thinks she can humiliate this family, steal my granddaughter, and hide behind a foreign passport. She believes international borders apply to people like us. They do not." Tristan wiped his brow, leaving a streak of grease across his skin. "Mom, you cannot just send someone to Switzerland. DeAndre said she has a legal right to be there. She is a citizen, the Hague Convention. The Hague Convention is for poor people who rely on courts to fight their battles." Catherine interrupted, her tone laced with absolute blinding arrogance. "I rely on cash. I have just retained a private extraction team, 3 former military contractors who specialize in international asset retrieval. They do not ask questions, they do not care about jurisdiction, and they do not fail." Tristan stared at the manila folder. He had spent his entire life relying on Catherine's money to fix his messes. When he wrecked his first sports car at 16, her checkbook made it disappear. When he was caught embezzling from his fraternity in college, her massive donation built a new campus library, and the charges vanished. Now, facing the total collapse of his life, he fell right back into the familiar, pathetic safety of his mother's wealth. He nodded slowly, letting her take control. "They are already wheels up," Catherine stated, checking her diamond-encrusted watch. "By tomorrow morning they will have breached Sienna's flat, secured Lily, and arranged a private charter back to the States. Once I have my granddaughter, Sienna will have no choice but to drop her whistleblower claims and beg for a plea deal. We will crush her." 4,000 miles away, the cold, crisp air of Geneva settled over the historic Eaux Vives district. The streets were quiet, the cobblestones illuminated by the soft, warm glow of antique street lamps. Three men in dark, tactical civilian clothing moved purposefully down the quiet avenue. They did not look like typical tourists admiring the architecture. They carried themselves with the predatory confidence of men who were used to using brute force to solve complex problems. They had easily tracked the IP address of my secure server connection directly to my father's family flat. Catherine had paid them an astronomical sum to ignore Swiss sovereignty, break down my door, and physically abduct a 5-year-old child. They assumed this would be the easiest, most lucrative job of their careers. They expected to find a terrified, isolated American housewife cowering in a luxury apartment. The lead operative bypassed the building's main security panel with a digital cloning device in less than 30 seconds. The heavy oak lobby doors clicked open and the three men slipped inside, moving silently up the winding marble staircase to the 3rd floor. They reached my landing. The lead investigator signaled his men to fan out, covering the narrow space. He pulled a heavy hydraulic breaching tool from his duffel bag, positioning himself directly in front of my reinforced iron door. He raised his hand ready to give the signal to strike. He never got the chance. Before the metal tool could even graze the wood of my door, the lights in the stairwell instantly snapped off, plunging the hallway into absolute darkness. The quiet, terrifying click of a dozen weapon safeties being disengaged echoed through the tight space. Suddenly, blinding tactical lights flared from the stairwell above and below them. A dozen crimson laser sights pierced the darkness, painting the chests and foreheads of the three mercenaries. They were completely boxed in, trapped in the narrow corridor with nowhere to run and no cover to take. "Drop the weapon. Put your hands on your heads and drop to your knees," a voice commanded in perfect, unaccented English. The lead investigator froze, squinting against the blinding glare of the tactical flashlights. Standing on the landing above them were 10 heavily armed agents of the Swiss Federal Police, the Fedpol. They were clad in full tactical gear, their submachine guns raised and perfectly steady. I watched the entire scene unfold in crisp, high definition from the security monitors inside my study. Catherine actually believed her American money made her untouchable. She thought she could send armed thugs into Geneva to steal a Swiss citizen. She had no idea that the moment I landed, I had registered a high-level threat assessment with the local authorities, providing them with Catherine's exact financial profile and history of aggressive retaliation. The mercenaries dropped to their knees, their hands raised in surrender as the Swiss authorities moved in to apply heavy steel cuffs. Catherine's expensive, ruthless extraction team had not even made it to my doorstep. The heavy iron doors of my building slammed shut, echoing through the feed of my security monitors as the Swiss Federal Police marched Catherine's $1 million extraction team out into the freezing Geneva night. The mercenaries were shoved into the back of armored transport vehicles, their tactical gear stripped, their arrogance entirely erased. I took a slow sip of my coffee, watching the convoy's blue lights flash against the cobblestones until they disappeared around the corner. Right on cue, the encrypted satellite phone resting on my solid oak desk began to vibrate. It was a video call request. The caller ID was routed through a secure proxy, but I knew exactly who was on the other end. Catherine and Tristan were expecting a confirmation call from their team leader. They were expecting to see me in zip ties, weeping and begging for mercy, while they booked a private charter to drag Lily and me back to Boston. I adjusted the angle of the camera to ensure the serene, snow-capped peaks of the Swiss Alps were visible through the window behind me. I tapped the green accept button. Tristan's face filled the screen. He looked terrible. His usually perfectly coiffed hair was matted to his forehead with sweat, and his designer collar was unbuttoned and wrinkled. Behind him, I could see the familiar mahogany bookshelves of Catherine's drawing room. Catherine stood just over his shoulder, her posture rigid, her eyes darting around the frame, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. "Where are they?" Tristan demanded, his voice cracking with a frantic, desperate edge. "Where is the team?" "Put Davis on the screen right now, Sienna. If you try to negotiate with them, I swear to God." I cut him off, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotion. "Davis is currently sitting in the back of a Swiss Federal transport vehicle, Tristan. He and his two associates are being processed for international espionage, attempted kidnapping, and carrying unregistered firearms across international borders. They are looking at a minimum of 20 years in a Swiss high-security prison. Tristan stared at the camera, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. Catherine shoved him aside, pulling the laptop closer to her own face. "You are lying?" Catherine spat her aristocratic mask, slipping to reveal the raw panic underneath. "You do not have the capital to hire a security detail capable of intercepting top-tier military contractors. I froze your joint accounts. You have nothing. You are a glorified accountant trying to play a game with people who own the board." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the desk. "You still do not understand what is happening, Catherine. I did not hire private security. I did not need to spend a single dime. The men who just arrested your extraction team were agents of the Swiss Federal Police." Tristan wedged his way back into the frame, his face flushed red. "Why would the Swiss police protect you? You abducted my daughter. You are a fugitive. I have lawyers filing extradition papers as we speak. You cannot hide from international law." "I am not hiding from international law, Tristan," I replied, enunciating every word with lethal precision. "I am enforcing it. I am a Swiss citizen. I hold a Swiss passport, and so does Lily. But more importantly, I am a fully protected federal whistleblower." The silence on their end of the call was absolute. The color drained entirely from Tristan's face, leaving him looking like a ghost. "For the past 5 years, you and your mother thought I was just a quiet, obedient wife, balancing your checkbooks?" I continued, letting the full weight of their arrogance crush them. "You thought my late father's estate was just a modest inheritance. You completely ignored the fact that my father was a senior auditor for the Swiss Financial Market Supervisory Authority. He taught me everything about cross-border banking regulations. When I found the first shell company you set up in Vanessa's name, I did not just confront you. I meticulously documented it. I tracked every single wire transfer, every offshore trust, and every fraudulent tax return you filed." "You are insane," Tristan whispered, wiping a shaking hand across his mouth. "I am thorough," I corrected him. "I took that entire mountain of evidence and handed it directly to the SEC, the IRS, and the Swiss banking authorities. I exposed the exact routes you used to launder millions of dollars. The Swiss government is not treating me like a fugitive, Tristan. They are treating me like their star witness in a massive international money laundering bust. They assigned an armed detail to my building the moment I landed because your mother's financial crimes have triggered a multi-agency federal investigation. You did not just send armed thugs to my flat. You sent them into a federal sting operation." Catherine staggered back from the camera, clutching the edge of a mahogany side table to steady herself. Her impenetrable empire was collapsing in real time. She had spent decades buying politicians, bullying judges, and silencing anyone who dared to question her family. Now she was staring at the one woman she had relentlessly underestimated, the woman who had just handed her over to international authorities on a silver platter. "Sienna, please," Tristan begged, his voice dropping an octave, completely abandoning his aggressive posture. "We can fix this. We can reach an agreement. You do not have to do this to the family. Lily needs her father." I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. It was the smile of a predator watching its prey realize the trap had already snapped shut. "You do not get to use Lily as a bargaining chip anymore, Tristan. I severed your parental rights the second my plane left the tarmac, and the financial crimes are just the beginning of the paperwork I filed." Tristan blinked, his desperate expression faltering into absolute confusion. "What are you talking about? What other paperwork?" I leaned back in my leather chair, letting the silence stretch out for a few agonizing seconds. I wanted him to feel the fear. I wanted Catherine to hear every single word. "By the way, Tristan," I stated, my voice echoing coldly through the computer speakers, "I filed the medical records in family court this morning. The ones from my private physician in Boston. Do you want to tell your mother why I needed an emergency infectious disease screening last month? Or should I read the clinic results out loud right now?" Tristan's face went entirely slack. He lunged toward the laptop camera, his eyes wide with a sudden frantic terror. "Shut up, Sienna!" Tristan hissed, his hands gripping the edge of the mahogany desk so hard his knuckles turned white. You are bluffing. You do not have any records. You are just trying to provoke my mother. I did not blink. I reached just outside the camera frame and pulled a thick white envelope bearing the unmistakable crest of Boston General Hospital onto my desk. I slid the official laboratory report out, holding it up so the high-definition lens could capture every damning line of text. Department of Infectious Diseases. I read my voice as calm and steady as a metronome. Patient Sienna Thorne. Diagnosis positive for a severe antibiotic-resistant strain of syphilis, accompanied by secondary complications requiring an emergency intravenous treatment protocol. The silence that fell over Catherine's drawing room was absolute. Tristan looked like he had been physically struck. He stumbled backward, his heel catching on the edge of the Persian rug, sending a crystal bourbon decanter crashing to the hardwood floor. It turns out your quarterly executive golf trips to Miami were far more strenuous than you let on. Tristan, I continued, letting the cold reality of my words sink into his skin. Though I suppose sleeping with high-end escorts without protection does carry its own unique set of occupational hazards. Catherine stood frozen. She stared at the screen, and then she slowly turned her head to look at her son. For a fleeting second, the naive, hopeful girl I used to be thought I might actually see a shred of maternal horror. I thought Catherine might express a single ounce of sympathy for the fact that her son's reckless, selfish infidelity had permanently compromised my health. I should have known better. You filed this. Catherine's voice was a barely contained, breathy shriek. She stepped right over the broken glass on the floor, marching toward the camera until her face filled the screen. You filed these medical records in Suffolk County Family Court today. At 8 o'clock this morning, Boston time, I confirmed smoothly, along with my official petition for an at-fault divorce and full, irrevocable sole custody of Lily. Under Massachusetts family law, proving that a spouse knowingly transmitted a severe infectious disease constitutes extreme cruelty and reckless endangerment. Tristan is legally unfit to parent. He will never have unsupervised access to my daughter again. Do you have any earthly idea what you have just done? Catherine screamed, her hands flying to the sides of her perfectly styled hair. She was not looking at Tristan. She was glaring at me through the screen, her eyes completely wild with a terrifying primal panic. Family court filings are public records, Sienna. They are accessible to the press. The Boston Globe combs through those dockets every single morning. I watched the realization wash over her in real time. Catherine Thorne, the undisputed queen of Boston's elite social circles, was not horrified that her son was a serial adulterer. She did not care that I had spent a week in a hospital bed attached to an IV drip. She was having a complete psychological meltdown because her pristine, carefully curated social facade was about to be globally obliterated. My friends at the country club. Catherine gasped, her breathing turning shallow and erratic as she backed away from the laptop. The foundation board members, the charity gala committee. They will all see this. They will read about my son carrying a venereal disease in the morning paper. We will be the laughingstock of the entire East Coast. They will read about a lot more than that. Once the federal indictments drop, I reminded her, refusing to let her change the subject or minimize the destruction. But yes, Catherine, your country club friends are going to know exactly what kind of man you raised. Mom, listen to me, Tristan pleaded, taking a cautious step toward her with his hands raised defensively. It was one mistake, a minor lapse in judgment. Sienna is just trying to use this to extort us. We can pay her off. We can get a judge to seal the records. Extort you? I laughed, a sharp cutting sound that echoed through the quiet Swiss study. You have no money left to extort Tristan. The SEC seized it all because of the ledgers I handed over. And you have no legal leverage because I am safe in Geneva, protected by federal authorities. I did not file those medical records for a payout. I filed them to ensure that when a judge looks at your character, they see the exact same repulsive, selfish coward that I have had to look at for the last 5 years. Catherine spun around to face her son. The aristocratic composure she had wielded like a weapon her entire life completely vanished. Her face was flush, contorted with a vicious, ugly rage that stripped away decades of refined elegance. "You absolute fool," Catherine hissed, her voice vibrating with pure venom. "I spent 30 years building the Thorne family name, 30 years curating an impeccable reputation, ensuring we sat at the absolute top of this city's hierarchy." "Mom, please," Tristan stammered, shrinking back like a terrified child. "Do not interrupt me," she roared. "I paid off the dean at Wharton when you were caught embezzling from your own fraternity. I bought your way out of that horrific hit and run in Nantucket so you would not see the inside of a jail cell. I handed you a career, a fortune, and an immaculate public image on a silver platter because you are too weak to build anything yourself." Tristan swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward the camera, acutely aware that I was witnessing his utter humiliation. "We can hire a crisis management firm, Mom. We can spin the narrative. We will say Sienna fabricated the documents to steal Lily. Spin a public court filing, detailing your incurable venereal disease." Catherine shrieked, the sound distorting the laptop's microphone. "Spin the fact that your own brother-in-law is currently cooperating with federal prosecutors because you were too stupid to cover your digital tracks." She closed the distance between them in two swift predatory strides. The sharp, echoing crack of flesh hitting flesh startled even me. Catherine slapped Tristan across the face with such ferocious force that his head snapped violently to the side. The impact left a bright red hand-shaped welt blooming across his pale cheek. "You have ruined us!" Catherine screamed, her voice breaking. She raised her hand and struck him again, a brutal backhand that sent him stumbling against the wall. He threw his arms up to protect his face, but he did not dare strike back. "You ruined the family name. You ruined the legacy. You have left us with absolutely nothing." I sat back in my leather chair watching the mighty Thorne empire fracture and collapse. The impenetrable alliance of inherited wealth and arrogant entitlement was shattering under the weight of its own corruption. They were turning on each other, tearing themselves apart exactly as I knew they would once the money and the prestige were stripped away. I reached forward and rested my hand on the laptop keyboard. "Enjoy the morning papers, Catherine," I said quietly, ensuring my voice cut cleanly through the sounds of her screaming at her son. "And Tristan, make sure you pack a warm coat for federal prison. I hear the winters in upstate New York are absolutely brutal." I pressed a single button, ending the call and plunging the screen into darkness. The screen went black, leaving Catherine and Tristan in the suffocating silence of the drawing room. But the quiet was temporary. The true devastation of my actions did not hit until the sun rose over Boston and the financial markets opened. The family court filings were public record, and as Catherine had accurately predicted, the press had been tipped off. By 8 in the morning, local news stations were running breaking segments on the sudden SEC raid at Thorne Capital, using the scandalous divorce documents and the severe medical disclosures as fuel for the fire. Tristan retreated to his home office, locking the heavy mahogany doors behind him. He sat paralyzed behind his desk as the first alert pinged on his secure server. Then came another, and another. Thorne Capital was an institution built entirely on generational trust and the illusion of impenetrable stability. Now that illusion was being violently dismantled on live television. Major clients, tech billionaires, legacy real estate tycoons, and overseas investors were watching the news cycle detail Tristan's frozen assets and his complete moral bankruptcy. The withdrawal requests flooded the firm's servers in a relentless digital avalanche. Tristan watched the dashboard flash red as his clients scrambled to pull their money out before the federal government seized everything. $10 million vanished in the first minute. 50 million followed. By 9 o'clock, the total surpassed 200 million. The firm's phones rang incessantly, a chaotic symphony of angry, panicked investors demanding their capital immediately. Tristan could not answer a single call. He was legally paralyzed by the SEC freeze, and the offshore accounts he usually relied on had been drained by my disclosures. Within 3 hours, a massive, catastrophic bank run had decimated his portfolio. He was watching his entire empire bleed out to zero in real time. Desperate, sweating through his ruined silk shirt, Tristan bolted from the office. He needed a lifeline. He needed liquid capital to cover the immediate margin calls and halt the panic. He sprinted through the sprawling estate and found Vanessa in the solarium. She was furiously typing on her phone, surrounded by designer luggage, hastily stuffing cashmere sweaters and expensive jewelry into a leather duffel bag. Tristan grabbed her by the shoulder, spinning her around. He demanded she call her private wealth manager. He needed her to take out a second mortgage on her Aspen villa and leverage the Boston townhouse. He pleaded with her, his voice cracking with hysteria, explaining that if he could just show the board a sudden influx of liquid cash, he could temporarily stabilize the firm's standing. Vanessa yanked her shoulder out of his grip, her face contorting into a mask of bitter, pure cruelty. She let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed off the glass walls of the solarium. "You are completely out of your mind," Vanessa spat, kicking one of her suitcases toward the door. "There is no equity left to pull, Tristan. None. The townhouse has 3 liens on it, and the Aspen property is mortgaged to the absolute maximum limit." Tristan stared at her, the color draining from his face. He asked how that was even mathematically possible given her massive monthly allowance. Vanessa stepped right into his space, her aristocratic facade completely shattered by her own mounting panic. She revealed that her opulent lifestyle, the private jets, the European shopping sprees, and the endless renovations had been funded entirely by borrowing against those properties for years. She had been relying on the dirty money Tristan pushed through DeAndre's escrow accounts just to make the minimum interest payments to the banks. "I am completely broke!" Vanessa screamed, her voice shrill and desperate. "DeAndre took the last of the clean cash when he walked out of here. He emptied our personal joint accounts before he got on that plane. You are not getting a single dime from me because there is absolutely nothing left to give. You built a house of cards, Tristan, and you expected me to foot the bill when the wind blew." Tristan stumbled backward, the sheer totality of their ruin pressing down on his chest like a physical weight. He sank onto a velvet chaise lounge, burying his face in his hands. They were out of money, out of allies, and out of legal options. The federal government was closing in, and their social circle was actively watching them burn. Heavy, deliberate footsteps echoed against the marble floor of the hallway. Catherine appeared in the doorway of the solarium. She was no longer the poised, elegant matriarch holding court at country club galas. She was dressed in a dark trench coat, clutching a secure satellite phone in her hand. Her face was pale and drawn, but her eyes burned with a maniacal, dangerous determination. She had lost her social standing, her wealth, and her dignity. The loss had stripped away all her refined pretenses, leaving behind nothing but pure, unfiltered malice. The situation was completely beyond the realm of legal repair. It required brute force. "Get your coat," Catherine ordered Tristan, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm, absolute register. She turned to her executive assistant, who was trembling quietly in the hallway. "Charter the jet immediately. Clear the flight path directly to Geneva. Pay whatever bribes are necessary to bypass standard customs protocols." Tristan looked up, his eyes wide with genuine terror. He stared at his mother as if she had lost her mind. "Mom, you cannot do that. The Swiss federal police are sitting right outside her flat. They arrested your extraction team. We cannot just fly into Switzerland and walk through the front door. We will be arrested on the tarmac." Catherine stepped forward, grabbing the lapels of Tristan's shirt and hauling him to his feet with a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength. She did not care about the law anymore. Her money and power had always insulated her from consequences, and her arrogant brain simply refused to accept that the shield was gone. "We are going to Switzerland," Catherine hissed, her grip tightening until the fabric tore slightly. "We are walking into that flat, and we will force that girl to sign a full retraction if I have to physically hold her hand to the paper myself." The private jet touched down on the tarmac of Geneva Airport, just as the morning sun broke over the Jura Mountains. Catherine did not wait for the cabin crew to secure the stairs. She was out the door, her trench coat billowing in the crisp alpine wind, Tristan trailing behind her like a reprimanded child. The flight had been 8 hours of suffocating silence, punctuated only by Catherine's venomous muttering about how she would personally ruin my life. They bypassed regular customs through a VIP terminal, Catherine throwing cash at a private driver to break every speed limit in the canton. 20 minutes later, The black Mercedes sedan screeched to a halt in front of the imposing centuries-old limestone facade of Banque Privée de Genève. It was the fortress holding the remaining fragments of the Thorne family's hidden wealth. Catherine marched through the towering brass revolving doors. The lobby of the bank resembled a quiet sacred cathedral, vaulted ceilings, pristine marble floors, and an atmosphere of absolute untouchable discretion. In Boston, Catherine was royalty. She was used to bank managers dropping their coffee and sprinting across the lobby the moment she walked into a branch. She expected the exact same subservience here. She approached the massive reception desk, slamming her designer leather handbag down on the polished stone. "I need to see the Director of Wealth Management," Catherine demanded, her voice completely shattering the hushed reverence of the room. "Immediately. Tell him Catherine Thorne has arrived, and I want the paperwork to unfreeze my offshore trusts printed and ready to sign." The receptionist, a young man in an immaculate tailored suit, did not flinch. He did not scramble. He slowly looked up from his monitor, his expression entirely devoid of the fear Catherine was so used to inspiring. "Do you have an appointment, madame?" he asked in flawless, unaccented English. "I do not need an appointment." Catherine snapped, her face flushing with indignant rage. "I am one of the largest American account holders in this institution. My son's firm routes hundreds of millions of dollars through your vaults. You will fetch the director right now, or I will ensure you are looking for a new job by lunch." Tristan stepped up beside her, trying to project a dominance he clearly did not feel. He was running on adrenaline and sheer panic, his eyes darting around the lobby. "Listen to her," Tristan ordered, leaning over the counter. "We have attorneys standing by in New York and London. If you do not grant us immediate access to the Thorne family accounts, we will bury this bank in international lawsuits. We are the victims of a fraudulent asset freeze initiated by a disgruntled former spouse, and we demand access to our capital." A set of frosted glass doors opened behind the reception desk. A tall, silver-haired man with an aura of absolute authority walked out. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit and carried a sleek electronic tablet. He did not look intimidated. He looked mildly inconvenienced. "I am Monsieur Blanchard, the Senior Vice President of Compliance," the man said, his tone clinical, cold, and utterly dismissive. "And I must ask you to lower your voices. You are in a Swiss financial institution, not a public trading floor." Catherine squared her shoulders, ready to unleash decades of Boston's socialite fury. "I do not care what your title is, Blanchard. You have illegally locked me out of my own money. My daughter-in-law, Sienna Thorne, has manipulated your banking authorities with fabricated whistleblower claims. I demand you release my funds, or I will drag this bank's reputation through the mud." Monsieur Blanchard adjusted his silver-rimmed spectacles. He looked at Catherine not with respect, but with the specific detached pity a scientist reserves for an insect under a microscope. Madame Thorne, Blanchard replied, his voice perfectly smooth. "You seem to labor under the delusion that American wealth buys immunity from Swiss federal law. It does not. Your accounts were not frozen because of a domestic dispute. They were seized under direct orders from the Swiss Financial Market Supervisory Authority. We do not respond to threats, we do not fear American civil lawsuits, and we certainly do not bend to public temper tantrums." Tristan's jaw dropped. He had spent his entire life watching his mother verbally bulldoze anyone who stood in her way. But here, thousands of miles from the safety of their country club, Catherine's influence was absolutely worthless. Her money meant nothing to men who managed the wealth of entire nations. "You cannot do this," Tristan stammered, his facade crumbling. "That money is the only thing keeping my firm alive. The SEC is tearing my life apart in Boston. I need those offshore reserves to satisfy my margin calls. Sienna stole my daughter, and she is holding my money hostage." Blanchard's expression hardened into a mask of pure ice. "We are fully aware of your situation with the SEC, Mr. Thorne. In fact, our compliance department has been in direct communication with American federal prosecutors since yesterday evening. The assets in question are currently classified as evidence in an international money laundering syndicate. You are incredibly fortunate that my security team has not already handed you over to the local gendarmes for creating a disturbance." Catherine turned red, her chest heaving as she struggled to comprehend her total loss of control. I want to see the director, she demanded, her voice dropping to a dangerous, desperate hiss. Now. I am not leaving this building until I speak to the person in charge. You are harboring a fugitive. Sienna is hiding somewhere in this city, and I know she is using your bank to facilitate her crimes. Blanchard looked at her for a long, agonizing moment. The silence in the lobby was deafening. Then a tiny, almost imperceptible smirk touched the corner of the Swiss banker's mouth. As you wish, Madame Blanchard said, gesturing toward a set of heavy, secure elevators at the far end of the lobby. The Director of Wealth Management has actually been expecting your arrival. If you will follow me to the executive boardroom. Catherine shot Tristan a triumphant look. She adjusted her coat, mistaking the banker's compliance for submission. She honestly believed she had won. She believed that once she was behind closed doors with the director, she could bribe, threaten, or bully her way back to the top of the food chain. Tristan wiped the sweat from his forehead, letting out a shaky breath of relief as they followed Blanchard into the elevator. The doors closed and the elevator shot up to the penthouse level. The ride was silent. Catherine kept her chin high, mentally preparing her list of demands. She was going to freeze my accounts. She was going to demand my exact location. She was going to hire local mercenaries to drag me out of Switzerland. The elevator chimed, and the doors slid open to reveal a sprawling, ultra-modern executive floor. Blanchard led them down a wide corridor lined with abstract art and soundproof glass. They stopped in front of a massive set of solid oak double doors. The director and our key compliance officers are waiting inside, Blanchard stated, placing his hand on the brass handle. I suggest you choose your next words very carefully, Madame Thorne. I always do, Catherine snapped, stepping forward as Blanchard pushed the heavy oak doors open. Catherine and Tristan marched into the boardroom, ready to unleash their full arsenal of intimidation and arrogance. They took 2 steps into the cavernous room and stopped dead in their tracks. The blood drained from Catherine's face. Tristan let out a strangled, breathless gasp. The boardroom was vast, lined with panoramic windows overlooking the pristine waters of Lake Geneva. Standing along the walls were 3 armed agents of the Swiss Federal Police. Sitting at the sides of the massive mahogany conference table were 2 senior Swiss banking executives and a representative from the American consulate. And sitting comfortably at the very head of the table, dressed in an immaculate white blazer, with a steaming cup of espresso resting in front of her, was me. I smiled at my former mother-in-law, interlacing my fingers and resting them on the polished wood. You wanted to see the person controlling your assets, Catherine. I said, my voice echoing with absolute, undeniable authority. Take a seat. We have a lot to discuss. The sheer magnitude of the shock seemed to temporarily paralyze them both. Catherine stood frozen just inside the doorway, her manicured hand hovering uselessly over the brass handle. She looked from the armed Swiss Federal Police guards to the stoic banking executives and finally back to me. Her mouth opened, but the commanding, venomous words she had undoubtedly prepared died in her throat. For a woman who had spent her entire adult life orchestrating the destruction of others, walking blindly into an ambush was a concept her brain simply could not process. Tristan, however, lacked his mother's calculating restraint. His panic had fully mutated into a frantic, blinding delusion. He shoved past Catherine, his eyes locking onto the man sitting to my left. He recognized the official lapel pin immediately. You brought the American consulate. Tristan practically gasped, a manic, breathless smile stretching across his face. He actually believed this was a victory. He turned to look at Catherine, gesturing wildly toward the table. Do you see this, Mom? She played right into our hands. They brought the consulate. They are going to process the extradition right here. The representative from the consulate did not smile back. He adjusted his tie and looked at Tristan with a mixture of professional courtesy and profound pity. Mr. Thorne, the representative, stated, his voice echoing cleanly off the glass walls. I am not here to process an extradition. I am here as an official observer for a protected United States federal witness. I strongly suggest you lower your voice and take a seat. Tristan's manic smile vanished. His chest heaved as his rapid breathing echoed in the quiet room. He refused to sit. Instead, he reached a trembling hand inside his tailored suit jacket. The 3 Swiss guards immediately stepped forward, their hands dropping to the holstered weapons at their sides, but Monsieur Blanchard raised a single finger to halt them. Tristan pulled a thick, tightly bound stack of legal documents from his pocket. He marched toward the mahogany table and slammed the papers down onto the polished wood, the heavy thud ringing out like a gunshot. He leaned over the table, bracing his weight on his knuckles, bringing his flushed, sweating face as close to the camera lens of my laptop as he could. "Sign this!" Tristan snarled, a thick vein pulsing violently in his neck. "Sign this right now. It is a full waiver of alimony. It is a complete surrender of your passport, and it grants my mother immediate uncontested custody of Lily. You are going to sign this. You are going to call the SEC and withdraw every single complaint you filed, and in exchange, I won't have you thrown in a locked psychiatric ward the second we land in Boston. I will tell the judge you had a postpartum psychotic break. I will save you from federal prison Sienna. But you have to sign this right now." I looked down at the documents. The arrogance was staggering. His empire was burning to the ground, his extraction team was currently being processed for international felonies, and he still believed he possessed the authority to dictate the terms of my surrender. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply reached out and picked up the delicate porcelain cup resting on its matching saucer. The rich, dark aroma of the espresso grounded me in the reality of the moment. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the hot liquid warm my throat. I placed the cup back down. The soft clink of the porcelain was the only sound in the room. "You brought the wrong paperwork, Tristan," I replied smoothly. Before he could launch into another screaming fit, the heavy oak door connecting the boardroom to the private executive suite clicked open. DeAndre walked into the room. He looked immaculate. He wore a sharp charcoal gray Tom Ford suit, his posture perfectly relaxed. In his right hand, he carried the heavy leather briefcase that I knew contained the darkest, most closely guarded secrets of the Thorne family's financial syndicate. Tristan exhaled a massive, shuddering breath. The tension visibly drained from his shoulders as he looked at his brother-in-law. To Tristan, DeAndre was the ultimate fixer. He was the brilliant legal mind who had spent years cleaning up Tristan's messes, hiding Catherine's offshore transfers, and keeping the family completely untouchable. "Glad you made it, DeAndre." Tristan sneered, turning his venomous glare back to me. He pointed a shaking finger at my face. "Show this crazy woman the law. Explain to her exactly what happens to a spouse who commits international kidnapping and corporate sabotage. Destroy her." DeAndre did not walk over to Tristan. He did not stand by Catherine, who was watching him with a sudden, dawning suspicion. Instead, DeAndre walked around the long expanse of the mahogany table. He pulled out the ergonomic leather chair positioned directly to my right. He sat down, placed his heavy leather briefcase on the table, and calmly snapped the brass latches open. He looked up, meeting Tristan's frantic gaze with absolute chilling indifference. "I am not your lawyer anymore," Tristan, DeAndre stated, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "I am hers." Tristan's jaw went completely slack. He stumbled backward as if he had been physically struck, bumping into Catherine. Catherine gripped his arm, her manicured nails digging into his suit jacket as the reality of the ultimate betrayal washed over her. "What are you talking about?" Catherine hissed, her voice trembling with a rage she could barely suppress. "You work for me, DeAndre. I built you. I made you a partner. You are married to my daughter." "I filed for divorce from Vanessa yesterday morning," DeAndre corrected without missing a beat. "She drained my personal accounts to fund her lifestyle while secretly leveraging all of our properties. But more importantly, Catherine, I am not going down with your sinking ship. Sienna approached me 6 months ago. She showed me the shadow ledgers you were keeping, the ones where you forged my signature to authorize the Cayman Island wire transfers. You were setting me up to be the sole fall guy when the federal government inevitably caught up with you." "That is a lie," Catherine shrieked, entirely abandoning her aristocratic composure. "You ungrateful parasite! You are nothing without this family." "I am a man with full federal immunity," DeAndre replied calmly, pulling a pristine single sheet of paper from his briefcase and sliding it across the table toward Tristan. "I surrendered my role as chief counsel for Thorne Capital yesterday. I handed over every encrypted drive, every unredacted email, and every falsified tax return directly to the Department of Justice. In exchange for my complete cooperation, they granted me blanket immunity. Sienna and I have been coordinating this transition since the day you threatened to take Lily from her. Tristan stared at the single sheet of paper resting in front of him. His hands were shaking so violently he could not even pick it up. "What is this?" Tristan choked out, his eyes darting between me and DeAndre. "That is your actual divorce settlement," I answered, lacing my fingers together on the table. "It is a voluntary surrender of all your parental rights. It is an admission of fault in the marriage due to your documented infidelity and reckless endangerment of my health. And it is a complete, irrevocable forfeiture of any claim to my assets or the federal whistleblower bounty I will be receiving from the SEC. I will never sign that," Tristan yelled, slamming his fist onto the table. "I will fight you in every court in America. I will drag this out for a decade. Then you will go to federal prison for 20 years, I said softly, the absolute finality of my words suffocating the last remaining embers of his defiance. "And your mother will be in the cell block right next to you. Sign the paper, Tristan, because the Swiss police standing behind you are just waiting for my signal to execute the international arrest warrants." Tristan stared at the settlement resting on the polished wood, his breathing shallow and erratic. He looked at DeAndre, his former brother-in-law, his primary fixer, the man who had expertly buried every illicit trade and quieted every defrauded investor for the last decade. DeAndre did not look back with any trace of the quiet subservience Tristan was so accustomed to demanding. He looked like a man who had finally excised a terminal tumor. "You gave them the ledgers," Tristan whispered, the horrific realization hitting him like a physical blow to the chest. "The Cayman accounts, the shell companies in Dubai." "Every single one," DeAndre confirmed, his voice devoid of any sympathy or hesitation. "I gave them the unredacted master files, Tristan. The exact drives you explicitly ordered me to incinerate after the federal audit last quarter. I handed over the routing numbers for the offshore trusts, the falsified board minutes, and the wire transfer logs you authorized using your client's pension funds to cover your personal margin calls. The Department of Justice has everything. The Securities and Exchange Commission has already frozen your domestic accounts based on my sworn testimony. You have absolutely no leverage, no liquid capital, and as of this morning, no legal representation." DeAndre leaned back in his ergonomic chair, gesturing toward me with a calm, deliberate motion. "I represent Sienna now. My sole professional objective is to ensure she receives maximum leverage and complete legal protection from the radioactive fallout of your collapsing criminal empire. I know exactly where every stolen dollar is buried, Tristan. And I am going to dig up every single one of them for her." Catherine could no longer contain the boiling pressure of her fury. The polished aristocratic facade that had intimidated Boston's elite for decades violently shattered, revealing the ugly, desperate core beneath. She slammed her hands onto the mahogany table, her knuckles turning white against the dark wood. "You ungrateful, treacherous thug," Catherine spat, her voice vibrating with pure, unfiltered malice. She rounded on DeAndre, her eyes wild, her face flushed with a terrifying rage. "We made you. You were an absolute nobody before you married Vanessa. You were a glorified associate drowning in student debt, and we elevated you. We brought you into our home, into our firm, into our exclusive social circles. We gave you a seat at the table with people who never would have looked twice at someone from your background." Catherine's upper lip curled into a vicious, ugly sneer. "You think wearing a tailored suit makes you one of us? You think because you married my daughter you suddenly possess our pedigree? You were a charity case, a diversity hire we took pity on. You should be on your knees thanking us for civilizing you. Instead, you bite the hand that fed you. You turn on your own family like a feral street dog. You will never work in this industry again, DeAndre. When I am finished with you, you will be stripped of your law license and begging for public defense cases in whatever slum you crawled out of." The room fell dead silent. The Swiss banking executives exchanged uncomfortable glances. The American consulate representative simply raised an eyebrow, writing a quick note on his legal pad. DeAndre did not raise his voice. He did not blink. He calmly reached into his suit jacket, pulled out his smartphone, and tapped the illuminated screen. A small red recording icon pulsed steadily. "Thank you, Catherine DeAndre," said his tone clinical and entirely detached. "I appreciate you speaking so candidly on the record." Catherine froze, her manicured hand suspended in the air. "What are you doing?" "I am documenting your absolute lack of remorse and your ongoing attempts to intimidate a cooperating federal witness," DeAndre explained, placing the phone face up on the table. The Department of Justice prosecutors are highly interested in the cultural dynamics of Thorn Capital. They asked if the firm's illegal activities were driven by a culture of arrogance and untouchability. Your little monologue, complete with the thinly veiled racial microaggressions and classist threats, provides perfect contextual evidence of your character. It will play beautifully in federal court when the prosecution establishes your role as the mastermind behind the family's financial crimes. Catherine's face drained of all color, transforming into a sickly, ghostly pale. The realization that her own venomous pride had just handed federal prosecutors a loaded weapon paralyzed her completely. She sank back into her leather chair, her breath catching in her throat, the fight completely draining from her rigid posture. She was trapped, and she knew it. "Sienna, please!" Tristan begged, his voice cracking, breaking the heavy silence. The arrogance was completely gone from him, replaced by a raw, naked terror. He looked like a cornered animal, his eyes darting from DeAndre to the Swiss police officers, standing immovably by the doors. "You do not have to do this. We can settle this quietly. I will give you whatever you want. You want the Boston estate. Take it. You want full custody of Lily Fine. I will sign the papers right now. Just call off the federal agents. Tell DeAndre to retract his testimony. We have a child together, Sienna. You cannot send the father of your daughter to a federal penitentiary." I looked at the man I had once thought I loved. There was no pity left in me. There was no hesitation. Every time I looked at him, I saw the nights he spent lying to my face, the systematic isolation, the way he and his mother had plotted to declare me mentally unfit, just to steal my child and silence my questions. "You lost the right to invoke Lily's name the moment you tried to use her as leverage against my sanity," I replied, my voice steady and cold. "You did not care about our family when you were draining innocent people's life savings. You did not care about being a father when you planned to lock me in a psychiatric ward just to protect your mother's bank accounts. You built a prison for me, Tristan. Now you get to live in one of your own." I reached down to the floor beside my chair and lifted a heavy, thick red folder. I placed it squarely in the center of the mahogany table. The bright red cover stood out violently against the dark wood. I slid it slowly across the smooth surface until it rested directly in front of Catherine. Catherine stared at the folder as if it were a live explosive. Her hands were trembling too much to reach for it. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with a terror she could no longer hide. "I didn't bring you here to negotiate my divorce," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "I brought you here to liquidate your entire family." The silence in the Swiss boardroom was so profound I could hear the faint ticking of Monsieur Blanchard's antique wristwatch. Catherine stared at the heavy red folder resting on the mahogany table as if it contained a live cobra. She did not reach for it. She simply glared at the thick crimson cardstock, her chest rising and falling in shallow, panicked breaths. She was entirely unaccustomed to being on the receiving end of a trap. I did not wait for her permission. I reached across the table and flipped the cover open. Inside rested a stack of aged, yellowing parchment preserved in clear archival sleeves. The ornate crest of the Thorn family was heavily embossed at the top of the first page. These were not digital copies or scanned replicas. They were the original physical blueprints of the Arthur Thorn Generational Trust, a financial behemoth holding exactly $400 million in diversified global assets. "Where did you get those?" Catherine demanded, her voice a reedy, thin whisper. Her eyes darted toward DeAndre, a lethal accusation forming on her face. "You stole them from my private safe. You broke into my home and you stole my property." DeAndre did not even blink. He adjusted his immaculate cuffs and leaned back in his leather chair. "I am fully immune, Catherine. Remember? And no, I did not steal them. I simply executed my fiduciary duty by handing them over to a forensic accountant who noticed a massive glaring discrepancy in your capital routing over the last fiscal year. I gave Sienna the keys to the kingdom and she mapped out every single hidden door. I slid the first archived document out of the folder and turned it around so it faced Catherine and Tristan. You spent the last decade mocking my career, Catherine. You told your country club friends that I was just a glorified bookkeeper, a human calculator who lacked the vision to understand real wealth. You forgot that forensic accounting is not about vision or social connections. It is about the microscopic absolute truth. It is about finding the lie buried under mountains of arrogant deception. Tristan leaned forward, squinting at the aged parchment, his brow furrowed in desperate confusion. "It is just my grandfather's trust charter," he said, his voice trembling. "He set it up before he died. He left everything to my mother to manage. Everyone in Boston knows that. It has been a matter of public record for 2 decades. Everyone knows the lie your mother told them." I corrected him, my tone sharp and unwavering. Arthur Thorne despised Catherine. He knew exactly what she was capable of. He knew she would cannibalize his empire to fund her vanity projects, assert control over his heirs, and finance your fraudulent trading firm. He never named her the trustee. The original charter explicitly appointed an independent board of directors to manage the $400 million, distributing the wealth only when you and Vanessa reached the age of 40. Catherine slapped her palm against the table, the sharp crack making the American consulate representative jump. "That is a fabricated lie. I was named sole trustee and granted absolute discretionary power over every single account. I have the signed amendment to prove it." The amendment Arthur signed on his deathbed. I smiled. It was a cold, deeply satisfying smile. I pulled a second document from the red folder. It was the amendment Catherine was talking about. A single piece of paper that had effectively handed her the keys to an absolute kingdom 20 years ago. The signature at the bottom read, "Arthur Thorne," in sprawling, elegant cursive. "For 20 years you paraded around Boston acting like the undisputed matriarch of a financial dynasty," I said, tapping my finger directly onto the signature. "You used this $400 million to bully competitors, buy politicians, and terrorize anyone who did not bow to you. You used it to fund Tristan's firm, masking his catastrophic losses and covering his illegal margin calls. You used it to threaten me and try to take my daughter. You built your entire identity, your entire life on the illusion of this inherited power." "It is not an illusion," Catherine shrieked, losing whatever was left of her polished composure. The Swiss police officers shifted their weight, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts, anticipating a physical outburst. "That is his signature. My father-in-law signed that document in front of witnesses. It is an ironclad legal directive." DeAndre let out a dark, mocking chuckle that echoed off the glass walls. "The witnesses were your personal driver and a notary public who mysteriously acquired a very expensive piece of coastal real estate a month later. I told you years ago that the amendment looked sloppy, Catherine. I told you the paper trail was incredibly messy and that the formatting did not match Arthur's usual legal filings. You threatened to have me disbarred and ruined if I ever questioned it again. You forced me to bury it, but I never destroyed the original. I kept it exactly for a moment like this." Catherine turned so pale she looked almost translucent. She was shaking now, a visible, violent tremor vibrating through her arms and shoulders. "You cannot prove anything," she stammered, looking wildly toward the Swiss banking executives for intervention. "She is a bitter, vindictive woman trying to steal my family's money. Throw her out. I demand you throw her out right now." Monsieur Blanchard did not move a muscle. He simply gestured toward the table, his expression completely blank, indicating that Catherine should continue listening to me. I looked directly into Catherine's terrified eyes, letting the silence stretch until it was agonizing. When I started tracing Tristan's missing assets for the divorce settlement, I did not just look at the digital ledgers. Digital files can be manipulated, erased, and rewritten. I requested the physical archives, because physical ink tells a story that cannot be altered by a clever hacker or a bribed banker. I sent this so-called ironclad amendment to an independent, highly classified chemical laboratory right here in Zurich. Tristan stared at his mother, the horrifying realization finally breaking through his denial. "Mom, what did you do?" he whispered, his voice cracking with absolute despair. "You told me the money was ours. You told me I was protected." "Shut up, Tristan," Catherine snapped, though her voice lacked any real power. She was hyperventilating, her eyes fixed on the red folder. I reached into the back of the folder and pulled out a crisp, newly printed lab report bearing the official seal and watermark of the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology. I slid it slowly across the mahogany table until it bumped gently against Catherine's trembling hands. "I am sure you thought you were incredibly clever 20 years ago," I said, letting the absolute weight of my words crush the last of her defiance. "You found old parchment. You practiced his signature for hours until you perfected the slant of the letters. You paid off the notary and you seized the $400 million. You thought you had committed the perfect crime, except you overlooked one microscopic scientific detail." I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table, locking eyes with the woman who had tried to destroy my life. "The chemical dating analysis on the ink you used to forge Arthur Thorne's signature is absolutely conclusive," I stated, my voice ringing out with terrifying finality. "The specific chemical compound of that black ink, the exact proprietary blend of dyes and solvents, was not patented, manufactured, or sold anywhere in the world until 2008. Arthur Thorne died in 1998. Catherine let out a sharp, breathless gasp, shrinking back into her heavy leather chair as if the lab report had physically struck her. "You forged a deathbed signature on a legal document, using ink that did not even exist until 10 years after the man was buried in the ground," I said softly, ensuring every single person in the room heard the absolute truth. "You are not a matriarch, Catherine. You are a fraud, you are a thief, and your empire is officially liquidated." The echo of the word liquidated hung heavily in the freezing air of the Swiss boardroom. Catherine seemed to physically shrink, her tailored trench coat suddenly looking 3 sizes too large. Her manicured hands trembled violently over the damning chemical dating report. She was entirely silenced, suffocating under the weight of her own shattered arrogance. Tristan, however, refused to surrender. His panic violently shifted back into a desperate, grasping delusion. He slammed his hand flat against the mahogany table, the sharp sound startling the consulate representative. "So what?" Tristan demanded, his voice cracking with sheer, unadulterated desperation. He paced a few steps, running a hand through his hair, attempting to project the impenetrable Boston elite persona he had worn his entire life. "So my mother cut a legal corner 20 years ago to protect the family from bureaucratic red tape. That does not change the fundamental facts, Sienna. You cannot liquidate me." Tristan turned his back on his hyperventilating mother and pointed directly at DeAndre. "The Arthur Thorne Generational Trust was built for the Thorne bloodline. Even if the amendment is voided by the Swiss authorities, the original charter dictates the assets descend to the primary male heir upon reaching maturity. That is me. I am Arthur Thorne's grandson. I am the sole male blood relative carrying the Thorne name. By default, probate law dictates those assets revert entirely to me. You and DeAndre can play all the forensic accounting games you want. You cannot rewrite genetics." Catherine let out a sharp, choked gasp. She looked up at Tristan, her eyes widening in absolute visceral terror. She weakly reached out to grab his sleeve, whispering for him to stop talking, but Tristan shook her off, emboldened by his own flawed logic. He leaned over the table toward me, a sickeningly confident smirk returning to his face. "I was raised to inherit this empire," Tristan sneered, his chest puffing out. "My grandfather built this wealth with his own bare hands, and his blood runs through my veins. The money stays in the family, and you are officially written out of it." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply turned to DeAndre, who sat perfectly still, a look of profound, chilling amusement dancing in his dark eyes. DeAndre reached into his leather briefcase and handed me a slender manila folder sealed with a blue medical cross. I laid it flat on the mahogany table, smoothing my hand over the cover. "You always were obsessed with your pedigree, Tristan," I said, my voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel. "You spent our entire marriage reminding me that I came from nothing, while you were born into a legacy of titans." You constantly claimed your financial genius was inherited directly from Arthur Thorne's supreme intellect. It is. Tristan shot back, squaring his shoulders and ignoring the way his mother was quietly sobbing into her hands. I am his direct descendant. The $400 million is legally mine. I slid the manila folder slowly across the table until it rested right on top of the forged trust amendment. When I started investigating the original trust charter, I found a very specific ironclad stipulation, I explained, watching the last remaining drops of color drain from Catherine's face. Arthur Thorne was an incredibly paranoid man. He knew exactly what kind of people surrounded him. He did not just demand that the money go to his heirs. He mandated that any beneficiary claiming the $400 million must submit to a biometric verification. A DNA test against his archived medical samples kept securely in a private Geneva clinic. Tristan frowned, his confidence faltering for a fraction of a second. Fine. Let them test me. Bring the clinic staff in right now. I have nothing to hide. That will not be necessary, I replied smoothly. Because as your wife, I had legal authority to retain your genetic samples during our extensive fertility treatments last year. I saved your comprehensive medical file. And 3 weeks ago, DeAndre formally submitted your genetic markers to the Geneva clinic to clear the trust's final security protocol. DeAndre leaned forward, folding his hands together. The Swiss authorities are incredibly thorough, Tristan. They cross-referenced your genetic markers with the bone marrow and blood samples Arthur Thorne deposited in their vault 30 years ago. The results were verified by 2 independent geneticists to ensure absolute compliance with the original charter. Tristan crossed his arms, his smirk returning. Then, the money is mine. You just proved my case for me. Open the folder, Tristan, I commanded. He snatched the manila envelope off the table, ripping the seal open with unnecessary force. He pulled out the stark white medical report bearing the official stamp of the Swiss genetic clinic. His eyes darted back and forth across the page. He read the first paragraph. Then he read it again. The silence in the boardroom became utterly suffocating. The air grew heavy, thick with the impending destruction of an entire family's identity. Tristan stopped breathing. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The paper shook violently in his hands as his eyes locked onto the final bolded conclusion at the bottom of the page. Catherine buried her face in her hands, letting out a wretched guttural sob that echoed miserably against the panoramic windows. Her greatest, darkest secret, the one she had committed federal fraud to cover up for 2 decades, was entirely exposed. I leaned forward, resting my chin on my hands, and offered Tristan a warm, devastating smile. Tristan, your mother had an affair with the pool boy 35 years ago. You aren't a blood relative of the man who built this empire. You have zero legal claim to this trust. Tristan dropped the Swiss medical report onto the mahogany table as if the paper itself had caught fire. For 3 agonizing seconds, his brain short-circuited, entirely unable to process the magnitude of the betrayal. He had spent his entire life wielding the Thorne legacy as an impenetrable weapon, believing himself to be the apex predator of Boston's financial food chain by sheer virtue of his genetics. Now that entire identity had been obliterated by a single sheet of paper. His shock rapidly mutated into a blind, explosive fury. Tristan lunged across the space between the chairs and grabbed Catherine by the shoulders of her designer coat. He hauled her upward, his fingers digging brutally into the fabric, shaking her with a violence that made the armed Swiss guards step forward from their posts by the door. Is it true? Tristan screamed, the sound tearing through his throat, raw and unhinged. Look at me. Is it true? Catherine did not fight back. The imperious, untouchable matriarch had completely vanished, replaced by a pathetic, trembling shell of a woman. Her knees gave out, and she collapsed back into her chair, dragging Tristan's hands down with her. She buried her face in her palms, her shoulders heaving with ugly, gasping sobs. She nodded a tiny, pathetic movement that sealed their doom. I had to protect us, Catherine wailed, her voice muffled by her hands and choked with decades of suppressed terror. Arthur knew. He always suspected. He threatened to cut us off entirely and leave me with nothing. I had to secure your future. I had to make sure you got what you deserved. You destroyed my future, Tristan roared, kicking his own chair so hard it crashed against the glass wall behind him. You lied to me my entire life. You made me commit federal crimes to protect a legacy that was never even mine. He backed away from her, running his hands over his face, his breath coming in ragged, hyperventilating gasps. He looked wildly around the room, finally locking eyes with DeAndre, desperate for some legal loophole, some twisted avenue of escape that his brilliant former counsel could magically provide. DeAndre remained perfectly still, his hands steepled on the polished wood, watching Tristan's meltdown with the detached fascination of a scientist observing a lab rat. The legal reality of your situation is absolute, Tristan DeAndre stated, his voice a cool, steady hum in the chaotic room. Arthur Thorne's foresight was extraordinary. He did not just suspect your mother's infidelity, he actively planned for it. The original trust charter contains a strict, unassailable, direct legitimate bloodline clause. It explicitly requires genetic verification before a single cent can be disbursed. You fail that requirement entirely. DeAndre paused, leaning forward to let that fact settle before driving the final nail into the coffin. Furthermore, your grandfather insisted upon a rigorous, clean legal record morality clause for any potential beneficiary or executor. Because both you and Catherine are currently facing impending massive federal felony charges for wire fraud, racketeering, and international money laundering, the trust is officially and irrevocably voided to both of you. You are permanently disqualified from seeing a single dime. Tristan stood frozen in the center of the boardroom. The adrenaline that had fueled his rage suddenly burned out, leaving behind a hollow, frantic emptiness. He looked down at the forged amendment, then at the DNA results, and finally at me. A dangerous, unhinged light flickered in his eyes. His chest hitched and a low, guttural sound escaped his lips. It took me a second to realize he was laughing. It started as a wet, broken chuckle and rapidly escalated into a loud, manic laugh that bordered on total hysteria. He pointed a shaking finger at me, his face twisting into a mask of pure, bitter triumph. "You think you won?" Tristan gasped, wiping a tear of manic amusement from his eye. "You think you beat me, Sienna? You just disqualified the only surviving heirs to the Thorne estate. Do you know what happens to a $400 million generational trust when there are no eligible beneficiaries left to claim it? It goes into probate purgatory, and then the government takes it. The state absorbs every last penny." He leaned heavily against the table, glaring at me with a terrifying, delusional satisfaction. "I might lose everything, but so do you. If I don't get the money, the government takes it all. You get absolutely nothing. Sienna, you burned down my empire just to walk away with ashes." I did not break eye contact. I did not shift in my seat. I let him savor his hollow, imaginary victory for a few fleeting seconds before I systematically dismantled it. I leaned back in my chair, smoothing imaginary wrinkles from my skirt, projecting an aura of total, untouchable calm. "Not quite," I replied, my voice slicing effortlessly through his manic laughter. "Have you ever heard of the SEC Whistleblower Reward Program?" Tristan's laughter died instantly. The blood drained from his face as a new paralyzing confusion set in. I laid my hands flat on the mahogany table, addressing him with the cold, measured tone of a professor delivering a final lecture. "I did not just come here to expose a forged will, Tristan. I came here to expose a $400 million corporate fraud and international money laundering syndicate. You are absolutely right about one thing. By submitting the unredacted master files, the routing numbers, and the shadow ledgers to the Department of Justice, the United States federal government is going to seize every single asset tied to the Thorne estate. They are going to liquidate the offshore accounts, the real estate portfolios, and the shell companies. They are taking it all." I paused, tilting my head slightly, watching the profound realization dawn in DeAndre's eyes as he nodded silently beside me. The American consulate representative stopped writing and looked up, a faint smile touching the corners of his mouth. "But under U.S. financial law, the government does not just keep the money they seize from massive corporate crimes." I continued, my words striking Tristan like physical blows. "They incentivize the exposure of that corruption. As the official federally registered whistleblower who provided the exact decrypted ledgers, thanks to DeAndre's incredible cooperation, I am legally entitled to a percentage of the recovered funds. Catherine pulled her hands away from her face, her tear-streaked makeup making her look utterly ghastly. What percentage, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the climate control. Under current SEC regulations, a whistleblower who provides original, timely, and credible information that leads to a successful enforcement action is entitled to up to 30% of the total seized assets, I stated, enunciating every syllable with absolute precision. I reached out and tapped my index finger twice against the polished mahogany table. The sharp, solid sound commanded the entire room. I don't need your divorce settlement, Tristan, I said, my voice steady, merciless, and echoing with absolute finality. The federal government is about to write me a legally binding tax-free check for $120 million. And you're going to federal prison. Tristan's mind completely shattered. The sheer weight of the absolute loss, his money, his name, his freedom broke whatever fragile restraint he had left. He let out a primal, deafening roar. His hands gripped the edge of the heavy mahogany table, his knuckles turning white as bone, and he vaulted over the polished wood directly toward me, his fingers stretched out like claws aiming for my throat. Catherine screamed a shrill, piercing sound that ricocheted off the glass walls. I did not flinch. I simply remained perfectly still in my leather chair, knowing exactly what was about to happen. Before Tristan could even close the distance, a blur of dark uniforms intercepted his path. The 3 Swiss guards who had been standing silently by the doors sprang into action with terrifying, coordinated precision. One officer tackled Tristan mid-air, slamming a heavy shoulder into Tristan's chest and driving him brutally onto the thick carpet. Tristan gasped. The wind knocked completely out of his lungs as a heavy combat boot pinned him to the floor. The heavy boardroom doors swung open with a violent crash. A dozen armed officers in tactical gear flooded the room, fanning out and securing the perimeter in a matter of seconds. Behind them walked a tall, sharp-featured woman in a crisp navy suit, holding a leather binder. She moved with an air of absolute authority, pausing at the head of the table to survey the chaos. She flashed a silver badge toward Catherine, who was now hyperventilating and pressing her back against the glass wall as if trying to melt through it. Interpol and Swiss Federal Police, the woman announced, her voice echoing with crisp, clipped efficiency. Tristan Thorne and Catherine Thorne, you are under arrest. Catherine clutched her chest, her eyes wide with unadulterated panic. You cannot do this, she gasped, her voice a fragile, reedy squeak. We are American citizens. You have no jurisdiction over us. This is a private banking matter. The Interpol liaison offered a cold, utterly unsympathetic smile. She dropped her binder onto the table right next to the forged trust documents. You forfeited any jurisdictional protections the moment you boarded a private jet to Zurich, the liaison stated sharply. You traveled across international borders with the explicit documented intent to intimidate a cooperating federal witness. She gestured toward me and DeAndre, then looked down at Tristan, who was currently struggling fruitlessly under the weight of 2 heavily armed officers. Furthermore, the liaison continued, her tone clinical and devastating. You attempted to access offshore accounts that are actively under investigation for international money laundering and wire fraud. By trying to move those assets on Swiss soil to evade the United States Department of Justice, you violated Swiss federal banking laws. You committed a severe financial crime in our country, Catherine. We do not need extradition approval to detain you. Tristan thrashed violently against the carpet, his face turning an angry, splotchy purple. Get off me, he screamed, spittle flying from his lips. Do you know who I am? I am Tristan Thorne. My family built Boston. You are making a catastrophic mistake. I will have all of your badges. I will sue this entire government. The officers did not respond to his threats. They simply grabbed his arms, wrenching them behind his back with a practiced, forceful movement. The sharp metallic click of handcuffs snapping shut around his wrists echoed loudly in the room. The sound was absolute. It was the sound of his entire empire locking shut forever. No, Catherine shrieked as 2 officers advanced on her. She scrambled backward, tripping over the legs of her chair and collapsing onto her knees. Please, I am a respected woman. I have a medical condition. You cannot put those on me. I will not survive in a cell. An officer calmly gripped her arms and hauled her to her feet, ignoring her frantic, pathetic sobbing. The cuffs secured around her wrists with another decisive click. The heavy polished gold bracelets she wore to project her wealth clanked uselessly against the cold steel of the police restraints. "This is your fault," Catherine screamed, thrashing her head toward DeAndre. "You set this up. You framed us to save yourself. You belong in a cell with us." DeAndre stood up slowly, buttoning his suit jacket with a look of supreme indifference. "I offered you a plea deal a year ago, Catherine," he replied smoothly. "I told you the federal audits were closing in and suggested you step down. You called me a coward and threatened to ruin my career. I merely provided the authorities with the exact files you ordered me to hide. Enjoy your accommodations. I hear the Swiss correctional system is highly efficient." The officers jerked Tristan to his feet. His tailored suit was wrinkled and stained his tie askew, his hair a disheveled mess. He looked nothing like the titan of finance he pretended to be. He looked exactly like what he was, a desperate, broken fraud who had finally run out of other people's money to hide behind. He locked eyes with me one last time as the officers began to drag him toward the door. "Sienna, please," he begged, his voice breaking into a pathetic, desperate whine. "Please tell them to stop. We can fix this. I will sign whatever you want. I will give you everything. Just do not let them take me." I stood up, picking up my purse and the delicate porcelain espresso cup I had been drinking from. I took one final slow sip, letting the hot liquid warm my throat before setting it back down on the saucer with a soft clink. "You already gave me everything, Tristan," I replied, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any mercy. "And you are right. We did fix it." The officers pulled him backward. He started screaming again, thrashing and kicking as they dragged him through the heavy wooden doors. Catherine followed, weeping uncontrollably, her expensive trench coat dragging along the floor as she was hauled out by her arms. Their frantic, terrified screams echoed down the pristine marble corridor of the bank, growing fainter and fainter until the heavy boardroom doors swung shut, cutting off the noise entirely. Silence returned to the room, thick and absolute. The American consulate representative packed up his notes, offering me a polite nod before exiting. Monsieur Blanchard silently gathered the forged trust documents and the chemical dating report, securing them in a locked briefcase for the authorities. I looked over at DeAndre. He picked up his leather briefcase and offered a small, genuine smile. "Are you ready to go home, Sienna?" he asked. I looked out the panoramic glass windows at the beautiful snow-capped Swiss mountains in the distance. The crushing weight of the last 10 years, the isolation, the gaslighting, the constant suffocating fear had completely evaporated. I breathed in, and the air felt remarkably clear. "Yes," I said, pulling my coat over my shoulders. "I am ready to go home." I stepped out of the boardroom and into the expansive, echoing expanse of the bank's main corridor. The air out here felt noticeably colder, smelling faintly of citrus polish and old money. Beside me, DeAndre walked with the relaxed, effortless stride of a man taking a casual Sunday stroll. We did not rush. There was absolutely no need. 50 yards ahead of us, the procession had ground to a violent, pathetic halt. The pristine marble hallway, usually reserved for quiet murmurs and discreet handshakes between billionaires, was currently the stage for a spectacular physical breakdown. Tristan had decided to plant his expensive leather Oxfords against the polished stone, throwing his weight backward in a futile attempt to resist the two massive Swiss tactical officers hauling him toward the private elevators. His suit jacket was torn at the seam, and his tie hung loosely around his neck like a broken leash. Catherine was putting up her own fight just a few feet away. She was struggling against the grip of the Interpol liaison, her designer trench coat slipping off one shoulder. Her hair, perfectly coiffed just an hour ago, was plastered to her sweat-sheened forehead in damp, frantic strands. She looked wildly around the empty corridor, her chest heaving desperately, searching for a manager, an executive, anyone she could command to fix this. But there was no one left to bribe. There was no one left to threaten. I watched as a profound, terrifying clarity washed over Catherine's face. The realization hit her with the force of a freight train. Her offshore accounts were frozen. Her trust was voided. The federal government possessed a chemical analysis proving her forgery, and the Department of Justice held the unredacted ledgers of her entire criminal enterprise. She was looking at the rest of her natural life inside a concrete federal cell. In that microscopic fraction of a second, the legendary, unbreakable Thorne family loyalty simply ceased to exist. "Wait!" Catherine screamed, her voice cracking as she dug her heels into the marble. She twisted her body, locking her terrified eyes onto the Interpol liaison. "You have to listen to me. I am a victim." The officers did not stop walking, but Catherine's frantic shrieking echoed off the high vaulted ceilings, forcing everyone in the corridor to hear her desperate pivot. "It was all him!" Catherine howled, raising her handcuffed wrists and pointing a shaking finger directly at Tristan's back. "He forced me to do it. Tristan forced me. I am an elderly woman. I trusted my son to manage the estate, and he manipulated the accounts. He set up the Dubai shell companies. He took advantage of my grief over my late father-in-law to push those trust amendments through. I had nothing to do with the wire fraud." Tristan's forward resistance evaporated instantly. He stopped fighting the officers dragging him toward the elevators and whipped his head around to stare at his mother. The sheer, unadulterated shock on his face was almost poetic. For 35 years, he had operated under the absolute certainty that his mother would burn down the world to protect him. Now she was throwing him directly into the incinerator to save her own skin. Tristan's shock lasted exactly 2 seconds before it was entirely consumed by a venomous, blinding rage. "You lying, treacherous parasite!" Tristan roared, his voice tearing through the corridor with savage intensity. He lunged backward, trying to break free from the guards to get to her. He fought with the manic, unhinged energy of a cornered animal kicking wildly at the officers who were forced to wrestle him against the marble wall to maintain control. "I forced you!" Tristan screamed, his face turning a blotchy, furious crimson as he spat the words at her. "You forged that trust document 20 years ago. I was a child. You orchestrated the entire Cayman's routing system. You explicitly ordered me to use my clients' pension funds to cover your personal margin calls. Last quarter, I have the emails." "Shut your mouth!" Catherine shrieked back at him, completely losing her mind. She lunged toward him, fighting the female officer holding her arms. "You incompetent failure! You ruined this family! You ruined my life! You ruined your own life! You pathetic fraud!" Tristan bellowed over her screams. "You are a criminal. You belong in a cage. I will testify against you. I will tell the feds exactly where you buried the real estate deeds. I will give them everything." They were practically doing the prosecution's job for them, screaming their confessions and betrayals into the open air of a Swiss financial institution. The officers finally had enough of the chaotic spectacle. With a series of sharp-barked commands in German, they muscled Tristan and Catherine into the waiting service elevators. The heavy steel doors slid shut, instantly slicing off the sound of their vicious screaming match. The abrupt silence in the hallway was deafening. I let out a slow, steady breath, the tension completely leaving my shoulders. I glanced at DeAndre. He was adjusting his cuffs, looking as though he had just finished watching a mildly entertaining, entirely predictable theatrical performance. We bypassed the service elevators and walked at a leisurely pace toward the main lobby. The grand panoramic glass windows spanning the front of the bank offered an unobstructed elevated view of the private courtyard and the pristine snow-covered street below. We stood side by side looking out through the thick glass. 3 sleek, heavily armored Swiss police cruisers were parked at jagged angles across the cobblestone courtyard, their blue emergency lights reflecting violently against the pristine white snow. I watched as the front doors of the bank swung open. The officers dragged them out into the freezing air. Tristan was still thrashing, fighting the officers right up to the door of the cruiser. He looked small, pathetic, and utterly stripped of his power. They shoved him roughly into the back of the vehicle, slamming the heavy reinforced door shut behind him. Catherine followed a moment later, her head bowed, her expensive coat dragging through the slush as they guided her into the second cruiser. The untouchable elites of Boston's financial aristocracy were officially gone. DeAndre turned away from the window, shifting his leather briefcase to his left hand. He extended his right hand toward me, his dark eyes shining with a deep, profound respect. Pleasure doing business with you, Sienna. DeAndre said, his voice smooth and steady. 6 months evaporated the Thorn Empire into nothing but ash and cautionary headlines. The final divorce decree arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning, stamped and authorized by a Boston family court judge in absentia. Tristan's signature was no longer required to dictate the terms of my life. He was entirely preoccupied rotting inside a high-security European holding facility, trading his bespoke Italian suits for a standard-issue gray jumpsuit. He spent his days pacing a miserable, freezing concrete cell, exhausting his last remaining shreds of sanity on a doomed legal battle against international extradition. The Swiss authorities were in no rush to hand him over, and the American prosecutors were perfectly content to let him suffer in Geneva until his inevitable transfer to a federal penitentiary. The custody hearing for Lily was over before it even truly began. The family court judge took one single look at the towering stack of federal racketeering indictments, the Interpol arrest warrants, and the staggering evidence of the Thorne family's generational criminal syndicate. With a swift, decisive strike of the gavel, I was awarded sole, irrevocable, legal and physical custody. There would be no visitation rights, no supervised calls, no lingering shadows. The Thorne family's toxic influence over my daughter was permanently surgically severed. She was safe playing in the sunlit backyard of our new home, completely oblivious to the corporate empire that had to be burned to the ground to secure her freedom. The collateral damage of the family's collapse was sweeping and absolute. Tristan's notoriously arrogant sister Vanessa found herself entirely stripped of the stolen wealth she had weaponized her entire life. With her bank accounts frozen by the Department of Justice and her elite social circle vanishing overnight, the brutal reality of survival hit her like a freight train. I witnessed her downfall firsthand just last week. I had stopped at a massive, fluorescent-lit discount retail store on the edge of town to buy some potting soil and garden shears. I pushed my cart up to register for, only to lock eyes with the cashier. It was Vanessa. She was wearing a stiff, ill-fitting polyester store vest over a cheap t-shirt, her plastic name tag pinned slightly crooked. Her signature manicured nails were chipped and broken, and the heavy dark circles under her eyes spoke of crushing, unrelenting exhaustion. The Birkin bags, the Cartier watches, and the diamond tennis bracelets were long gone, pawned off months ago, just to pay the retainer for a bargain bin defense attorney to keep her out of a federal cell for her tangential role in her mother's shell companies. Vanessa froze the barcode scanner, trembling violently in her hand as she recognized me. The color entirely drained from her face. She looked down at her cheap uniform, a suffocating, visceral humiliation radiating from her shaking shoulders. I didn't smile. I didn't offer a single word of pity or spite. I simply swiped my credit card, took my receipt, and walked out the automatic doors, leaving her trapped in the miserable minimum-wage reality she finally deserved. While the Thorns descended into ruin, DeAndre ascended. He walked away from the wreckage of his former corporate life and leveraged the immense respect he had garnered from the federal prosecutors to open his own private practice in downtown Boston. It was a highly successful, strictly ethical defense firm. He took only the cases he believed in, aggressively turning away the corrupt, high-paying corporate titans who desperately tried to buy his brilliant mind. We spoke on the phone regularly, two survivors who had navigated a deadly minefield and emerged entirely victorious. The sharp ring of the doorbell pulled me from my thoughts. I walked through the quiet, sunlit hallway of my house and opened the front door to find a federal courier standing on the porch. He was flanked by a black, government-issued SUV parked at the curb. He held a thick, heavy envelope bearing the unmistakable embossed seal of the United States Treasury. He required my direct signature, his demeanor strictly professional. I signed the electronic pad, took the heavy envelope, and closed the solid oak door. Walking back to the kitchen island, I slid my finger under the thick paper seal, tearing it open with a satisfying rip. I pulled out the crisp, watermarked document inside. It was a single official page from the Securities and Exchange Commission Whistleblower Reward Program, signed by the director of the Federal Task Force. I traced my finger over the bolded black numbers printed at the bottom of the page, confirming the finalization of the international asset seizure. The wire transfer had officially cleared my newly established private accounts. $120 million. I looked out the kitchen window, watching my daughter chase a butterfly across the green grass, and smiled. I did not spend the $120 million on a yacht. I did not buy a private island or a fleet of sports cars. I simply let the staggering sum sit in my newly formed, heavily encrypted accounts, gathering interest, while I waited for a very specific date on the Massachusetts municipal calendar. 6 weeks after the wire transfer cleared, the federal government began liquidating the seized Thorn assets at a public auction. The crown jewel of their entire portfolio was Catherine's beloved Boston estate. It was a sprawling, historic mansion in the most exclusive zip code in the state. For 3 decades, Catherine had used that house as a fortress of elitism, hosting lavish galas, rubbing elbows with senators, and systematically reminding me that I was nothing more than a peasant permitted to walk on her imported rugs. Now it was just item number 42 on a federal foreclosure list. I walked into the drab, fluorescent-lit municipal building wearing a simple, perfectly tailored suit. The room was sparsely populated. The Thorn name, once a golden ticket in Boston, was now absolute radioactive poison. No respectable family or developer wanted to touch a property seized under international racketeering and wire fraud charges. The estate carried the stench of federal prison. When the auctioneer called the address, the room remained dead silent. The starting bid was set at pennies on the dollar compared to its actual market value. I raised my numbered paddle. Going once, going twice sold. With a single signature and a cashier's check drawn directly from the reward money the government had given me for destroying them, I became the sole uncontested owner of Catherine Thorne's entire world. I did not move in. I did not even step foot inside the grand foyer. Instead, I drove out to the estate the following Tuesday morning and parked my car across the street. I stood on the sidewalk holding a cup of hot coffee and watched as a convoy of heavy yellow machinery rolled onto the pristine manicured lawn. I gave the foreman a sharp, decisive nod. The diesel engines roared to life. The hydraulic arm of a massive excavator swung backward, then slammed forward with terrifying, magnificent force. The iron wrecking ball crashed directly through the custom mahogany front doors, shattering the stained glass windows and tearing through the grand staircase where Catherine used to pose for society magazines. Dust plumed into the crisp morning air as the ancient brick walls groaned and collapsed inward. The crystal chandeliers shattered against the marble floors. Decades of generational arrogance, cruelty, and suffocating elitism were reduced to a mountain of shattered drywall and twisted rebar in a matter of hours. I watched the entire mansion get bulldozed entirely to the ground, taking a slow, peaceful sip of my coffee as the roof caved in. By the end of the month, the massive plot of land was completely cleared, leveled flat into a blank dirt canvas. I signed the deed over to a newly formed, fully funded nonprofit organization. DeAndre handled the legal structuring, ensuring the land could never be sold or reclaimed by any corporate entity. On that cleared dirt, we broke ground on a state-of-the-art facility. It was not just a domestic abuse shelter. It was a comprehensive financial literacy center for women. I had learned the hard way that financial abuse was the invisible chain keeping women tethered to dangerous men. The shelter offered secure housing, but more importantly, it offered aggressive legal counsel, forensic accounting services, and career placement. We employed a team of experts dedicated to teaching women how to uncover hidden accounts, freeze compromised assets, and rebuild their credit from absolute zero. We armed them with the exact same weapons I had used to secure my freedom. I made sure no woman who walked through those doors would ever be trapped by a man's bank account again. With the foundation of the shelter laid and the construction fully funded for the next 50 years, I finally packed my bags. The freezing winters and the cold gray skies of Boston belonged to a past life. I needed the sun. A warm, salty breeze drifted across the expansive lanai of my beachfront home in Hawaii. The rhythmic, soothing sound of the Pacific Ocean crashing against the white sand filled the quiet morning air. I sat in a woven lounge chair, feeling the tropical sun warm my bare shoulders. I took a slow sip of freshly squeezed juice, watching the vibrant green palm trees sway against an impossibly blue sky. A few yards away, Lily was happily digging in the sand, her bright yellow sundress fluttering in the wind. She was 5 years old now, her laughter bright and completely unburdened. She knew nothing of offshore accounts, forged wills, or federal indictments. She knew only safety, warmth, and a mother who loved her unconditionally. Lily dropped her plastic shovel and trotted over to me, her bare feet pattering softly against the wooden deck. She climbed up onto the lounge chair beside me, resting her head against my arm. Mommy Lily asked, her big eyes looking up at me with innocent curiosity. "Are we ever going back to Daddy's house?" I looked down at my beautiful, brilliant daughter. The shadows of the Thorne family were thousands of miles away, locked behind steel doors and shattered reputations. They could never reach us here. They could never reach us anywhere. I smoothed a stray lock of hair behind her ear and offered her a bright, genuine smile. "No, sweetie," I replied, my voice steady and vibrating with absolute peace. "We own our own house now." Lily smiled back, satisfied with the answer, and hopped down to run back to her sandcastle. I leaned back in my chair, looking directly at the camera. The journey had been brutal. I had walked through absolute fire, dismantling a dynasty of titans who believed they owned the world. But I had not just survived the flames. I had harnessed them. The ultimate revenge isn't just destroying those who hurt you. It is building an empire they can never touch.
I used to ride upon your shoulders, thinking you could touch the sky. Every road felt less uncertain when I saw the world through your eyes. You were stronger than the mountains, taller than the northern pines. And when the winter winds were coming, you would stand between them and I. Time kept moving like the river. Years slipped slowly out to sea. But no matter where life took me, you were always part of me. I am my father's daughter. In every step I take, in every time I choose to stand. When it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, your fire inside my soul. And though the years keep moving on, your love still leads me home. You taught me strength is not in power, but in kindness when it's hard. You taught me how to keep on going when the road grows cold and dark. Every lesson, every story, every laugh around the flame lies within me like an echo, calling softly through my name. And when I face my greatest battles, when I feel I can't go on, I can hear your voice beside me saying, "Child, you're stronger than you know." I am my father's daughter. In every step becomes. I am my Father's daughter, and I always will remain. Through every triumph, every loss, through every joy and every pain, the world may change around me, the stars may fade above, but I will always carry with me my Father's endless love. And when they ask me who I am, I'll smile and answer softly.